I am Gautam Kumra, Chairman of McKinsey Asia, and you're listening to the Future of Asia podcast series. The Asian century has begun. The region is now the world's largest economy. As Asia's economies evolve further, the region has the potential to fuel and shape the next normal. In each episode, we are going to feature conversations with leaders from across the region to discuss what Asia's rise means for businesses across the globe. Join us.
Hello and welcome to McKinsey's Future of Asia podcast. I'm Clay Chandler, Executive Editor for Asia at Fortune, and I'm joined by Gautam Kumra, Chairman of McKinsey's Asia offices, and Joe Ngai, who is Chairman of McKinsey's Greater China offices. Gentlemen, welcome. We have a lot to talk about in this episode. We're going to start with this year's World Economic Forum in Davos and what we learned there. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the big recent developments in trade, technology, and geopolitics, and try to sort out what all of those things mean for Asia and for Asian business leaders. And maybe we can conclude with a few predictions for what's left of the very tumultuous Year of the Snake. So I'll begin by just saying thank you both for inviting me to join McKinsey at Davos for its annual Asia dinner and to lead the discussion there. It was fascinating, a very impressive gathering, more than 70 top executives from all around the region. We had a lot of CEOs, and it was a full hour of very frank discussion. I learned quite a lot. Of course, it was all Chatham House rules, so we can't really share here who said what, but I'm hoping that the two of you can maybe share some of the insights that you offered to that group and maybe recap some of the key takeaways from what we heard from the group as well. And Joe, maybe we could start with you because you concluded that dinner with a very inspiring exhortation to CEOs in the group to remember that there are often opportunities to be found in chaos and that it's an important duty of CEOs and leaders to remain optimistic. And I heard that word optimism quite a bit during the week in Davos. But by the same token, 3 days later on the last day of the week, there he was, the newly elected American president. And if you're running a global business, he vowed to slap stiff tariffs on companies that don't make products inside the United States. So I guess my opening question to you, Joe, is, are we still optimistic?
So, Clay, I think that what we are sure of is that we're in for a year of a lot of uncertainty. And in my eyes, I do think that it's also a year where for leaders of companies and also nations in Asia, where it could define the next decade to come. I think that what was very clear in Davos was that if you think about all the technology trends, the demographics and macro trends, Asia has a lot to be optimistic about. I look at countries like India and what's happening in there. I look at the revival in Japan and what we're seeing in a lot of corporates who are waking up to a lot of activist investors, looking at reforming themselves. And if you look at China, we saw DeepSeek really taking over, the Gen AI discussion. And I think that there is a lot to be optimistic about. But Clay, as we heard, I think geopolitics will be front and center of many things. And I think for CEOs, never before has there been so much emphasis of being very close to what's happening politically, right? I think that CEOs in the past, especially in Asia, we just kind of minded our own business. We did what we're good at. We made some of the best value for money products. And we had an assumption that the world would love us. The East to West trade was what defined a lot of developed economies for decades. But that is also changing. So I think that we're in for a year of a lot of adjustments and excitement. But I would say that we should be also very confident because a lot of the macroeconomic factors is really in the favor of Asia.
That's great. And you raised some really interesting points, which I hope we can follow up on. Gautam, I want to come to this point about the tariffs and think about what that will mean for business leaders in the region. But you said some really significant things at the opening of the dinner in Davos about the way in which the Asian economies are evolving and changing and how trade flows are changing in ways that might potentially make it easier for Asia to cope with all the upheaval we've seen in the East-West trade flow lately. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
So let me start by maybe acknowledging what I said at the dinner, which is we are at a time when Asia is turning from being a minority of the world to becoming a majority of the world. We're turning the wheel on that. And I think if you look at it from any lens you want, you look at firstly simply economic growth. More than half of the world's economic growth is now being driven out of Asia. You look at consumption. 2024 is an important milestone year where more than half of the people that live in Asia are going to be either in the rich or consuming category, which has never happened before. And by 2030, more than two-thirds of all the middle income households are going to be sitting in Asia. If you look at manufacturing as an example, more than half of the share of value-added manufacturing is now coming from Asia. And more than half of the world's trade now touches Asia and is growing at a rate faster than the trade that's happening around the world. I think no matter what lens you take, it's fair to acknowledge that in this world that is going through tremendous change, Asia's centrality and role as becoming a majority of the world is only going to become more important. In that context, if I just double click on trade, you see there are a couple of important things happening today on the trade front. One is trade as a percentage of GDP has been largely flat. But what's interesting is that if you look at the trade and services, IP, and people movement, it's been growing at a rate faster than trades and goods. So that's the first thing to acknowledge. Even though physical goods as a percentage of GDP has been flat, Asia trade, even of physical goods, has been growing at a rate faster than in the world. So Asia is getting more connected with amongst each other in Asia. The world is getting more interconnected through data, intellectual property, services, and people movements. In that context, it's important to recognize that 18 of the 20 fastest growing trade corridors, when I say trade corridors, I mean take an example of Vietnam, US, 18 of the 20 fastest growing trade corridors now touch Asia. And 13 of the 20 largest trade corridors now touch Asia. So I think Asia is going to be right at the heart of all the geopolitical movements, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I sort of hear you say two things there. One is that Asia is doing a lot more intra-Asian trade, that there are more consumers, those consumers are richer, and there's more connectivity between the markets so that they can trade with each other. And so that's thriving. But then also, I'm fascinated by this idea of business corridors, that there are corridors that connect Asia to other trade partners that aren't the traditional, just send things to Western markets. There are new opportunities outside the region as well in ways that businesses and economies can cooperate and collaborate.
Exactly, Clay. I think I tend to think of it in three parts. There are ones that have been old and established and growing. So if you look at Vietnam's trade with China, and if you look at just the last 5 years, we've seen an increase in about $50 billion of imports from China into Vietnam. And as you can imagine, that is catching the attention of the US for a variety of reasons. But then you see what I call new and growing corridors. India, Japan is an example of that. If I spend a lot of time in Japan these days, and when I talk to businesses in Japan and CEOs of the markets around the world they are thinking of outside of the US, India comes up more often than not. It's probably at the top three list of most Japanese CEOs. And if you think about India's need for infrastructure investments and the consumption opportunity India offers combined with Japanese technology and product, there's a real synergistic play there. So I see that as an emerging corridor, rather already an existing corridor that can get stronger. And then finally, something on the horizon would be an example would be India Middle East, which the Prime Minister Modi announced that as a potential strategic corridor.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I certainly noticed at the dinner that there were very large contingents of business leaders from Japan and India. And what surprised me is that they seemed to know each other. And I was surprised to speak to some of the Japanese leaders and learn that many of them have been multiple times to India just in the past year. I wonder if either of you could say something about also the links between the Middle East and Southeast Asia, because Anwar has just announced this new conference that he's doing that's going to bring together the GCC countries to meet with the ASEAN countries in Kuala Lumpur, which feels like quite an exciting, kind of interesting opportunity. It's a new grouping. I guess they've announced that China is going to be part of that conference as well. But what potential do you see for collaboration between the Gulf states and ASEAN?
Clay, I think that it is very, very interesting in terms of what the Gulf states are trying to do. If you go to Dubai, Riyadh, Qatar, what you see there is really a optimism about the next 20 years of growth, of development. But what they really would like is really how they both use their capital to think about investments but it is also around attracting investments back into that, the Gulf states as well, right? So I think that what I've seen is a very interesting phenomenon of both capital flow from the Middle East into Asia, but also a lot of investment flow back from Asia into the Middle East. And I was in recent discussion of like factories, new industrial production trying to land in the Middle East. And I do think that this is a very, very new phenomenon with any Asian company. But I think increasingly, as every country is thinking about how do I play in the next 20 years, especially around technology and industrialization, the former model that we grew up with, where East uses low labor costs and manufacturing produces and then exports to the West, is extremely outdated now. I think in the next few years, it's going to be a lot of very interesting investments, trade, right? But also a lot of cross-regional collaboration and a lot of these fertilization of new companies and JVs and models that we've never seen before. So I do think that we are in for a new models of collaboration across these regions. And I think that people who get in the forefront of this are going to really prosper. And the people who are using the old models will slowly become irrelevant in this new world order.
It's interesting, at dinner, I didn't realize who I was going to see, but I bumped into an Indian CEO who is a Singaporean citizen who has moved to Riyadh. And I asked him what you're doing here. And his answer was quite simply that, look, this is where the action is. And he said, we have the mission to build $100 billion company in outsourcing manufacturing electronics in Riyadh, and they don't have the skill set and the leadership experience. So I moved there to build that. So I think you're going to see more movement of talent and the companies that will be a part of their journey to industrialize these countries. Equally, you have long-term capital. To Joe's point, if you look at Southeast Asia, if you add it all together, is an economy comparable to India in size. It's almost $3.5 trillion, growing at a healthy rate. The complexity is it's not one market, so you've got to pick your spots. When you have long-term capital, looking at the next 10 years, I think Southeast Asia will have to be on the agenda.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the comparison between the relative size of the two economies. We mentioned that we saw Japanese and Indians, people from the Middle East there in force. One group that seemed to be less prominent than perhaps in years past was delegates from China this year at Davos. And Joe, how do you see the outlook for China right now?
I think that the Chinese economy has been a subject of a lot of global attention, and it rightfully should be. I think that China is still going to be at this year 30% of global growth, and its current rate of 4.5% to 5% growth, I think it's still very healthy for an economy of this size. But at the same time, if you talk to any Chinese company within China, I think we're disappointed with the domestic demand. Domestic demand, as you know, there are many, many factors that drive that. But one of it is actually consumer sentiment and consumer confidence. In the last couple of years, I would say the consumer confidence is a low point, and that is really due to real estate prices. That bubble has burst. I would say that there's a lot of employment that feels like it would not be like the previous 2 decades. So therefore, there's a little bit more pessimism around both employment in terms of, are these jobs going to lead to more upward mobility, right? Are we getting into a bit more of call it the middle income trap a lot of people are talking about? So I think that the headline really is that on a global size of GDP growth, China is still in a very reasonable size, but domestic demand, I think, is the one factor that everyone wishes can get back on a more healthy trajectory. And that one still remains something where I think the authorities and everyone else is very focused on. Do I see upside on there? Yeah. I mean, I think that right now everyone is having very low expectations of how that is going to pan out for the rest of the year. But I think with low expectations, you see in the equity markets where people feel like, oh, are we underestimating a little bit what both the government is doing and what, the recovery is going to happen. So we'll see.
It's interesting to kind of see who's thriving and adapting to the challenges in the China market and who's struggling. There have been a bunch of very high-profile multinational companies that have really had a hard time the last few years in China. Is this still a market where foreign businesses can thrive and grow and prosper?
So I do think that what we're seeing is the ultra competitive market, right? I actually do not think that there's any other market in the world as competitive as the Chinese market. Just because they're local companies doesn't mean that they're thriving. Like every single local company is also fighting for their lives. So is every single multinational company. The question is, in this demand kind of benign environment and where everyone is looking at all sort of competitive edges. We talk about electric vehicles. I think that's one market where features and new cars and models come out every 2 months. And I think that the rate of innovation, the pace at which the competitive intensity is increasing, I think whether you're multinational or your local company, if you're not up to that game, you just have no chance. And I think that's what a lot of companies are finding out right now.
Gautam, I'd love to get your thoughts about India sort of as a comparison there. I mean, last year at Davos, the Indian delegation was able to boast that their economy was the fastest growing major economy in the world. They were growing at 7% plus. This year, the growth rate is down. How do you see prospects, again, for big global companies in the Indian market?
Certainly, if you start at the big picture, I think India is in many ways incredibly well positioned for the next decade and longer, just given some of the structural forces at work. If you look back at history, Clay, the reality is that while we've gone through lots of ups and downs, the Indian economy has delivered about 7% real GDP growth rate over the last 30 years, and there's certainly no reason to believe why it would not do at least that over the next 20. Yes, we are dealing right now with some structural weakness in the economy for a variety of reasons, including a bit of the slowdown in the government investment, which, by the way, was a big driver of growth in the last 5 years. But part of the reason I think India is extremely well positioned is because if you look at some of the fundamental forces that work here, one is simply the rising consumption driven by demographics. As you look at the number of middle class and income and consuming households is not just growing at single digits, it's doubling, tripling over the next many, many years. So that's driving consumption. Second is technology. India is one of the fastest digitizing countries in the world, right next to Indonesia and a couple other markets. And that has opened up avenues to connect people with providers of products and services in ways that was unimaginable. Everyone is on their smartphones with high degree of data usage, smartphone penetration, and the price points of data in India are the lowest in the world, as you know. Third is, I think, the working population. India continues to boast a very young population. Average median age is less than 30. The working population in India will continue to grow, at least to 2050, if not beyond, which is probably next only to Africa. Sustainability, energy transition, again, India is well positioned because there's a heck of a lot to build. India is now on a path to build 500 gigawatts in renewable over the next couple of years. When I put all of that together, structurally, I think India is relatively well positioned from where also supported partly by some of the geopolitical changes. Certainly, to sustain that growth, though, it's not all that simple. India needs to continue to reform on land reform, labor reform, financial services sector reform, and not just at the central level, but also at the state level. And I think if you see continued reform in many of those sectors, there's no reason to believe why India could not sustain that growth.
Your point about technology is a great one and is a perfect segue to get into the next topic that I wanted to hear from both of you about, which is artificial intelligence. I mean, certainly after Trump, AI was probably the second most popular topic that I heard during my week at Davos. I was struck that there was this sense of just super confidence on the part of the American tech giants for the full week in Davos. And then we all got on the planes and flew back. And when we landed on Monday, markets had a heart attack over this announcement about DeepSeek being able to create a large language model that was as good on performance metrics as OpenAI, apparently, and just radically cheaper. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about the significance of that, breakthrough, if that's what we think it is. Does this open and democratize the AI race?
I think that what is interesting is actually the notion that artificial intelligence or Gen AI, at least on the application level and on many levels, is not about just CapEx and deep pockets. I think whether it's DeepSeek or the next 15 AI companies that is going to come out in the next 2 years, I think that what is very interesting is around how companies will be able to harness the productivity and the promise of Gen AI. I think that's really, at least for me, what is most important. I think DeepSeek, the reason why it was an interesting phenomenon was because I think that we have been focusing only on the deep pockets and the kind of heavy investment side of it, which seems to be a handful of large companies around the world. But we have forgotten that actually it all comes down to how we're going to use it. Are there better ways to use it? What's the value for money around this? And I think we are really in the first chapter of this. To be honest, I don't know whether Gen AI will democratize companies, but what I do know is, like many things else, the key is around how companies actually think about how to use it. What I'm seeing is that companies are unable to actually use it in the way that is productive. I think that companies are having, small test cases here and there, but at the heart of it, it's around the willingness to revisit all your processes, your willingness to think about your functional organization in very different ways. And I think, like in many technology, the bottleneck is not technology. The bottleneck is humans and organizations. And that's where I hope that Asia CEOs, based on all the euphoria that's going on right now, will take a very deep look at ourselves and say, hey, are we becoming the bottleneck of technology, of Gen AI? And can we leapfrog and move ahead?
I agree with Joe fully. I think what the DeepSeek moment to me is an example of the rate of technological progress. I think what we've proven to the world is that we have solved the artificial general intelligence problem. Having said that, what are the unlocks? To Joe's point, what are the constraints? And I mentioned three, call it institutional constraints, and then I come back to the human constraint. So energy, semiconductor chips, and data are going to be the institutional constraints. It's not these. If you look at the history of the world, we have solved these kind of problems. In the US, this will be probably $1 trillion of investments by the end of this decade, which is about 3% of GDP. It's a bit like what US had to do when they were putting together telecom internet infrastructure. So it's going to be a time for that kind of infrastructure build. But the constraint currently, as we speak, while the technology is moving faster than one can imagine, human limitations are coming in the way of extracting value and delivering results into the bottom line. So, as you know, McKinsey has been out there talking about this is beyond tech and building capability, digital quotient, and change management capability in companies is where the puck is right now. And hopefully, this year will be a turning point from tech to value.
I'm reminded kind of the moment that India got connected by undersea cable to became easy for data to kind of move at the speed of thought to companies in markets around the world and beyond borders. And it feels a little bit like it's a moment where we're having these revolutionary technologies emerge at a very rapid pace that can enable these firms that sort of seized on these technologies to suddenly become global players. Do you see, Gautam, could there be a kind of Indian equivalent of DeepSeek that breaks out in the next year or two? Is that a possibility?
It is certainly a possibility, but I think where my mind goes is, look, one is depends on where the new battleground is going to be. There certainly will continue to be a global battleground around the large language models, right? Which is a big game. What DeepSeek has shown is that maybe it's possible to do that game at different cost curves, but that certainly is the game of big data, big money, and over time. I'm actually even more excited about what one can do on the application layer and how one can leverage these models and also develop small LLMs and more language context specific models that can drive massive productivity and customer experience at much lower cost. For example, a market like India, I think will probably use AI differently from a developed markets because given the low labor costs in India, I wonder whether the opportunity is less in cost saving, but more in customer experience, for example.
That's quite a powerful insight because I think, I don't know what your experience is in speaking with clients, but mine in talking to business leaders is that the real opportunities around AI are not going to be just cost saving, that the people that really are going to move the needle with these new technologies are people that are thinking, okay, how do I use them to enhance the product? So that it's the way I've heard some people put it, but think of these things not as painkillers, but as vitamins. What more can you do with them instead of how can they get rid of your costs? And I think that has interesting implications for the entire region. Let me ask just a quick question about global macro outlook. As a business leader, should I be worrying about inflation again? Should that be part of my risk scenario?
Clay, I say this recognizing we are not economists and certainly are not the right ones to predict, but I think it would be foolhardy to not plan at least for a scenario where inflation remains high and difficult to get down. As a business leader, one has to think of all of this as not just risk management, but also an opportunity for creating value and maximizing value. So I think if I was a business leader, I would be looking at both defense and offense. When I say defense, I'd be wanting to understand my supply chain, my manufacturing footprint, my global network, how resilient is that against those different scenarios, including tariffs and inflation. If I was on the other side, I'd be also looking at equally where do I want to double down? Which are some of the economic corridors and markets I want to focus on? And then finally, how do I build my own organization's capability to keep a tab on all this ever-changing world? How do I equip my board? How do I equip my management team to help guide the company in this very turbulent time? So I would say one has to think about the inputs, actions one can take in this context. You can't predict all the scenarios. So how do you build that capability in your team to navigate as soon as you have new information is the way I would pose the challenge, including the one scenario where inflation does not come down.
Yeah. I don't know, Joe, does it feel to you like there's more turmoil right now that we're at this moment that is much less predictable than any moment since maybe even the financial crisis?
Clay, we've been through the last couple of years where we've seen COVID, we've seen wars, we've seen inflation. Is that going to be more volatile than what we saw in the last few years? I don't know. I think what we need to do is to take all this in stride, and that's just kind of part of our lives. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty here, but I feel like if I was company CEO right now, we are in the same position like everyone else. So the question is going to be, in this playing field, how do I have more agility? How do I pivot earlier and faster? And I think that there is a case for inflation, but I look at all the other things, right? I mean, there's more deregulation. There seems to be more opportunities that will be opening up in other forms of collaboration. I think that investments actually in the United States could be opportunities that no one has ever thought of, but maybe it's one that's opening up right now. So I tend to be an optimist around these. And I think that as long as you move faster than three guys next to you, there's always something in here. So I think maybe uncertainty and volatility is just par for the game. We just have to feel like that's going to be what it is. And we got to move fast. The one other comment, which I think is important, is that I think for a long time, business leaders, especially in Asia, never thought about politics in a very big way. I think that kind of geopolitical muscle, I don't think we ever thought about it that much. We felt like we were like kind of passive takers of a geopolitics that we have no part of. But I think increasingly it seems like we have to be kind of active participants, or at least active observers around these, be able to pivot in different ways. I feel like even as a large local company, I feel like you have to think about your global footprint in a more positive way, a more proactive way than before. I think that for diversification reasons, for future opportunities reasons, for the ability to change around operations when you need, I think it seems to be more important. So I think it ushers in a bit of a new era for everyone. And as I said in my earlier comments, I think the bar for everyone is higher now. So I think that that's what we all need to kind of raise our own standards.
Really fascinating. We're just about out of time, but I hinted at the top that I might invite you both to kind of offer predictions for, is there one thing that you think will be a surprising development in the remainder of the year ahead?
That's a tough one, but I can tell you one thing. As we often say, the rate of change will never be this slow again. And I think it's certainly true this year. I expect that this is going to be certainly a tumultuous year. My sense is if you look at the deck chair, if you look at the top 20 companies at the beginning of this year and by the end of this year, I think I'd be surprised if there's not a dramatic change in the pecking order, simply because many will not survive this degree of change and some new companies will thrive.
Fascinating. Joe?
My prediction is that right now we look at all this stuff, the tariffs and all the new geopolitics and all that, and we feel a little bit frustrated and maybe sometimes wondering whether the world is being too chaotic. My prediction is whether this actually makes everyone sharper. I wonder whether, European companies, right, by all this, is going to wake up. I wonder whether Japanese companies are going to become more aggressive. I wonder whether Chinese companies are going to think about how they give play in the new global order. I wonder whether all these stuff, right, is actually going to, in some ways, be a wake-up call for everyone to become more resilient, more agile. So I wonder whether all of this isn't part of a grand plan to sharpen all of our antennas to be more, in some ways, a modern corporation that is able to withstand basically all kind of shocks. And that at the end will be grateful, right, for all of us having to deal with all this uncertainty.
I love both of those points. And I think that's a great kind of note to end on. I mean, I think, Gautam, that your observation that we may see a lot more volatility in the winners and losers on the coming year's Fortune Global 500 list, that seems very spot on to me. And Joe, the last time you all had me on the podcast, we kind of ended by musing that no one likes change. It's difficult. You get out of your routines, but it's often what you need to move forward, and it forces you to kind of innovate. And that's the source of change, of innovation, is constant change. I want to thank you both. This has been really fascinating for me. And again, I really enjoyed being part of your wonderful dinner in Davos. Thanks very much, and I hope to continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Future of Asia podcast by McKinsey & Company. To learn more about McKinsey, our people, our latest thinking, visit us at mckinsey.com/Future of Asia or find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook.